Today we're continuing our series on I Give Thanks, and then the Advent series starts next week. We're going to look at the characters of Christmas. And so today I want to give a message on I Give Thanks, and it's on part 4. There's so much to be thankful for in our lives. I'm thankful for my family. We did a lot of fun things for Thanksgiving. We ran in the turkey trot, and by run, I mean walk. I did the turkey walk, and we did it with our dog who loves the croissants from Blue Talon Bistro. Whenever anybody drops one, our dog gets it. Anyway, it had a great time, and I was wondering, how many of y'all actually cooked food that put on the table for the rest of the family for Thanksgiving? Many of y'all did it. How many of y'all were thanked for the cooking that you did? Okay, so most of you are raising your hands. Some of you aren't so much. You know, sometimes we give thanks, and sometimes we don't even realize what people do. When I was a young kid, my mama in my family did basically everything. She did all the cooking, okay, and then we went and we watched football, and she did all the dishes. Okay, in fact, sometimes if I went in there to help, she'd say, no, I got it. It was just my mom. And now as an adult, I realize the amount of work it takes to cook that stuff, to clean up the dishes and put it away. And I am much more thankful to her for what she did as a kid. How many of y'all feel that way? I mean, I hope you do. Because there's a lot of times we don't give thanks because we don't realize the gravity of what was given to us. And sometimes I wonder if we realize what God does for us. So I have a friend who's a pastor, and he had a little daughter, his first kid. And when the girl was young, she was like, 2 or 3, and he would say, Laura, he and his wife would say, Laura, how big are you? And she would put her hand up and go, big, because she would think in her that she was really big. And so he said, Laura, how big are you? She'd do like this. She'd say, I'm huge, I'm enormous. And he figured it out. He was watching her growth weight change, and she had tripled in 1 year. And he figured it up. If she keeps growing like that, she's going to be 520 pounds by the time she's 7. So it didn't keep tripling. But she had this self-image that she thought of herself that was really big, which is not bad for a kid to think of themselves healthily, that they are, they're going to be a capable young person. And I wonder sometimes if we don't thank God enough because we don't thank God for how big he really is. Now, we live in a culture like that. Listen, I want to tell you something. Our God is big. And often we live in a culture that forgets that. And I wonder, when you face tough things in your life, when you have a need, if you have a small God in your mind, I'm not saying God is small, but if you think of it that way, it is going to be difficult for you. I mean, you're going to have to live with fear and anxiety because everything depends on you. And when you have a problem, you're going to think, what do I have to do to fix it? And if you have a small God, it could be unnatural to you to pray that much because you're thinking about your own things and what you can do. If you face temptation, and it's going to be easy for you to tell untruth because you failed at temptation, because you don't want anybody to think bad of you. Okay, because you don't have a big God. And if somebody's mad at you or disapproves of you and you are upset at that, you'll be twisted up in knots because you think it's all about my success. And against this backdrop of whether you have a big God or a little God, I want to look at the story in the Bible of Gideon. And it's a story that I think is perfect for today. Will you pray with me? Our Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can come together. And Lord, today we are going to remember how big you are. And we're going to be changed because of that truth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, in the book of Judges, back before they had kings, they have this story about a guy named Gideon. Okay, it begins Judges 6, verse 11. It says this: the angel of the Lord came and sat down under this oak tree, and he was disguised as a guy, similar to when I think it happened with Moses. He had met an angel, and an oak in this town called Ophrah, and that belonged to Joash the Abizrite. And by the way, Joash is the father of Gideon. And so where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. Okay, so you can read this, and we really don't get this because we don't know anything about threshing wheat. How many times have you threshed wheat lately? None. And so before I really get into this, I want to show a short video on what did it mean to thresh wheat in Jesus' day, okay, or in the ancient world. Let's look at this for just a second.
In the Bible, harvest time is referenced both as an actual practice and as a useful metaphor. Ancient Israel was an agricultural society. Their very survival depended on farming innovations and consistency. So when the time of reaping their produce came, it was an occasion for great celebration and joy as much as for hard work. The production of cereal grains has been called the backbone of ancient Israelite society and was largely composed of wheat and barley. Let's look at the wheat harvest as a model of harvesting and threshing. The wheat harvest took place during the summer and could overlap with the beginning of the grape harvest, making it a very busy and happy time of year. The reaping of wheat came first and could be done by hand or sickle. If by hand, the entire plant would be pulled up from the roots. To reap large fields of wheat, whole teams of people would normally be employed. A foreman would oversee the work, and reapers would make their way through the fields armed with sickles of flint or metal, cutting the stalks either halfway, leaving some of the plants still standing as straw for animals to eat, or for collection for different use. Wheat stalks could also be cut closer to the head of grain to minimize the work of winnowing later on. After the reapers would come teams of young men and women who would organize the cut stalks into piles and tie them into bundles called sheaves. Once the reaping was completed, the sheaves would be carried to the threshing floor. The location of threshing floors would likely have varied from area to area, as they needed to be in windy locations. Here, the stalks of wheat were turned into 3 products of varying worth: grain, straw, and chaff. The first step of processing the wheat was to cut the plant up to separate the valuable grain seeds from the plant stalks. This could be done by threshing stick, animal, threshing sledge, or threshing wheel. Threshing sticks wielded by harvesters would be used to beat smaller amounts of grain, maybe even for a quick meal or on products that had smaller seeds. Animals like oxen, with or without metal shoes, could be driven over the plants to crush them into pieces. Effective threshing sledges were also drawn by animals. They were boards inlaid with sharp stones and metal to chop the plants. And threshing wheels were carts made with rows of stone and metal inlaid wheels to accomplish the same. The chopped up wheat was then winnowed. Using wooden fork-like shovels, harvesters would throw the mixture high into the air to catch the wind. The different weights of the products meant that the wind would carry them different distances. The light and nearly useless chaff would be carried the farthest. The straw would fall closer to the harvester, and the valuable heavy grain would fall closest to them. The grain would be tossed up for another chance at blowing away remaining chaff, and then passed through a few sieves before being measured for taxation and stored for human consumption.
Okay,
Thanks
so
for watching.
That was the story of how they did this wheat, how they would take care of the wheat. But now in this text, it says Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press. So the way they usually threshed wheat, they have a place probably about as big as this room. Okay, and then they would bring animals in, and the oxen would pull a sled, and somebody would sit on the sled and would smash the wheat, which they'd thrown on the ground, and then they would throw it up in the air, and it would be drifted away, and they would have the seeds, and that's the way we would make wheat. Now, this is a wine press. Why would Gideon thresh wheat in a small, like, bathtub? Doesn't make sense. And the reason he did this is because he was scared. He was afraid. Gideon had great fear. He was afraid that the Midianites, who were very dangerous people that had been oppressing the Israelites really badly for 8 years. And so this image of who Gideon was, I don't know who you might think that Gideon might look like. Maybe he looked like this. The next slide. Okay, Kevin Hart. Okay, that's Gideon. Now, he didn't wind up being like this guy, okay, but he started out this way. He was very anxious about what was happening, so he was winnowing the wheat in a wine press, okay, and then going on in verse 12, it said, an angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said to him, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior, which is ironic because he's not a mighty warrior. He's Kevin Hart, okay? And pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied, but if the Lord is with us, notice how he changes the pronoun there. God says, the Lord is with you, and he changes it. Well, Lord, if you're with us, why has all this happened to us? And so he's looking at his life like we do sometimes and wonder why things haven't worked out like we thought they should. And where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? So he'd grown up hearing these stories about how big God was. But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. So they have been oppressed by this group of people for several years. And he's thinking, golly, if you're with us, why are things like they are? And so he's challenging what God is telling him. And I wonder sometimes when you think of God and when somebody looks at their life who's gone through some hard things, do they still have a picture of who God is? And so God, the Lord, responds to Gideon, and he talks about, this is bigger than what you're thinking, that I am bigger and that God is a bigger presence in your life than you ever can think of. And he says in verse 14, the Lord turned to Gideon and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? And so he said, I'm going to send you. You can do it. You can do what happened back with Moses when they got freed from the Egyptians. And Gideon responded and says, pardon me, Lord. He's not a man of great stature at this time. He says, but how can I do this? How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. He says, I'm the weakest of the 12 tribes. I'm the least in my family. I don't know what you are in your pecking order in your family, okay? Are you the youngest? Are you the smallest? Are you not the smartest? Anyway, he thought himself the weakest of everybody in the weakest clan, okay? And the Lord answered, well, it doesn't matter. I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. And so he says, it doesn't matter if you feel like you're the weakest. And so he gives Gideon the first challenge. Okay, and so the first challenge is they had this altar to Baal, okay, and in this town in which Gideon lived. And the altar was, it was a terrible thing because they worship the god of Baal, and that usually involves some kind of sexual practices and prostitution. And it even had animal sacrifice. The Midianites had animal sacrifices. Children's sacrifices. I said that wrong. They had children's sacrifices, and so which is a terrible thing. And so he said to Gideon, I want you to do something about this. Do away with it. Well, the problem was the Midianites didn't make this place of sacrifice, this pole and this altar. The Midianites didn't do it. The Jewish people did. And what's worse of all is it was his father that did it. And so he sees himself as the least in his family, and God has told him to go tear down something his father made as a leader in the village. And so Gideon decides, okay, I'll do it. And so Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him, went against his father, against the people. But because he was afraid, he was still afraid when he did it. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, remember, he's the least clan and the least in his family, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. So he did tear up this thing, but he did it at night. And say, so he tears down the pole. I'm not going to read every verse here, but you can read it in chapters 6 and 7 and 8. And Gideon's father, how do you think he responded? His son has torn up this place that the Midianites approved of and then Jewish people would approved of. And Joash, the people come against Gideon for doing this. They find out that he did it the next morning. But Joash, his father, replied to the hostile crowd that were coming against his son. And he stands up for his son. He says, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Y'all know who Baal is. You're going to take Baal's side instead of Gideon? Are you trying to save him? And whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. And if Baal is really a god, he can defend himself when somebody breaks down his altar. That's what he says to him. If Baal is really a god, he can defend himself when somebody breaks down his altar. And so his dad steps up. His dad steps up and supports his son. And so Gideon is successful with this. But now God continues to encourage Gideon to go against the Midianites. And so Gideon asks for a sign. He wants to know for sure that what God is telling him is correct. And so Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you've promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. Okay, and if there in the morning is dew on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I'll know that you'll save Israel by my hand, as you said. And so he has this test, okay, and the next morning there's dew on the fleece, it's wet, and the ground is dry. And then the next day he does the opposite. He said, well, now this next day, that could have happened because that's just the way it happened. But he said, now I have to do the opposite. And so the next day, he said, if you make the fleece dry and the ground wet. And he does that. And so he has this challenge, okay? And he starts to believe that, well, maybe I can do this. If you know that somebody is on your side, would you be braver? Okay, if somebody important. I had a friend, I still have a friend, Tim Leaptrot. He used to be here all the time, Tim. They moved to Savannah, and Tim is a great guy, and we used to play a lot of golf together. And Tim told me this story. He said, it happened a couple of years ago during Christmas that his family all got together, and all part of his family decided to go play golf together. Okay, they were going to play 9 holes, and a lot of them didn't play golf much. And so his brother was playing with him. It was a real busy day at the golf course, and they were playing, and it was backed up because they're young, they're new, and they don't know how to play golf that much. And the foursome behind them was impatient, okay? And so one of them hit the ball from the tee, and it almost hit Tim's brother. It landed right next to him. Okay, and Tim's brother said, is he supposed to do that? And Tim said, no. And so, they pulled up to the next green, and the other group pulled up alongside them, and Tim's brother nicely said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but you almost hit me with that ball back there. And the guy said, Well, you shouldn't even been playing golf, you blankety blank. I can't believe you're playing so bank slow. Cussed him out. And Tim's brother was really kind of shocked by that. Tim's brother's an older guy, and he didn't say nothing. And so that was like the last hole. And I got up to the clubhouse, and his brother's son, who was a Navy SEAL, 6'4", 230 pounds, solid muscle. So Tim walks up to him and said, "Hey, do you know what that guy said to your dad?" And he told his dad, he told his dad's son what he said. And all his son said was, "Huh." He jumped in a cart, drove the cart out in the middle of the fairway and said, "Huh, hey man," he got right in the guy's face with his finger, big guy. And he said, "Listen, did you hit that ball and almost hit my daddy?" He said, "Oh, well, all right, maybe." He said, "And did you cuss my daddy? Do you think that was funny? You think that's funny what you said to my dad?" And the guy would say, "Oh, well, I'm sorry. I was just, apologizing." And Tim told me that story. And I said, "Did you go behind your son, your nephew, and did you say, 'Yeah, that's right, and don't come back'?" I could see him doing that. No, he didn't do that. But if you knew somebody had your back, somebody that loved you very much and would stand up for you if somebody did something to you, would that make you braver? I hope so. When you think about life, about how much you go through, we all go through hard things. Sometimes you go through, this time of year especially, you have a lot of things going on, and maybe, you have to buy presents for people, you have to work longer hours, you have problems between people, families get in arguments, there's all kinds of things. And if you think you're the person to fix it all, wake up. You can't do it. If you're the one that's going to save everybody, then you need to kind of calibrate your thinking, because it's not in your power that you can do anything. It is in God's power, and God is a big God. He was there for Gideon. And even though this people that was in trouble, and even though Gideon was like Kevin Hart, God got a hold of him and said, it's not on your power. And so he gathered a group of people together, and it was going to be a battle. Now, he went around, I'm not going to read all the verses, but Gideon went around and gathered up people to fight the Midianites. And it was just the right timing. People were tired of the Midianites, and they had lived under oppression too long. And so he was able to gather around 32,000 soldiers, and you would think, wow, that's a great army. Unfortunately, the Midianites had 135,000 soldiers. And so there's this numbers problem. 32,000 versus 135,000. So he gathers them together, and he's worried to death about it. And God comes to Gideon and says, I need to do something with your army, Gideon. There's a numbers problem going on. And, Gideon says, well, I'm glad to hear you say that, God, because we just don't have enough people. And God says the opposite. You got too many. And so he says to Gideon, I want you to tell everybody who's afraid to go home. So of the 32,000 people, 22,000 soldiers leave. Leaves him with 10,000 against 130,000. And this is 13-1, okay? And then God says to Gideon, you still got too many. You got too many. Because see, there's this problem with the Israelites. They're thinking it's all about their own strength and that they are capable of conquering other people. He said, I want to make it clear that it's not on your strength that you're successful, but it's on me only. And so he has this challenge for them. He said, the ones that are left, he said, I want you to go down and drink from the lake. And when you drink from this, if you drink a special way, then you're going to be the ones picked. And so in verse 6, he says, 300 of them drank from the cupped hands, lapping like dogs, and all the rest got down on their knees to drink. Okay. And so now I was taught this story by my grandmother once. And she told me, yeah, because the ones who like knelt down and drank like this and looked around, they were the ones who were very alert. And so that was the best warriors. But as I've been studying this text, I found out that it might be a little different than that. There's this Old Testament scholar that says in the Bible, dogs are looked on in very negative way. I mean, we look at dogs as, wonderful. We love our dogs. I was talking to somebody the other day that they had gotten a rescue shelter dog, and he said, for all the money I've spent on that dog, I could have bought the finest purebred dog they have out there. And I said, well, why did you do that? And he said, well, I love the dog. I love the dog. Well, that's not the way dogs were looked on at this time. They were looked on as like, I don't know, maybe like we look at snakes. Some of you might like snakes, but most people don't. Most people didn't like dogs. They looked at them kind of like, I guess, I don't know, a pest. And lapping like dogs would have been a way of saying, these are the ones that were the nerdiest warriors. These were the least skilled warriors. It wasn't that these were like the, Navy SEAL guys. These were the best of the best, this 300. No, these were not, because the point of it all was that God was going to show it's not because of their strength, it's because of my strength. And so the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. With the 300 men that lapped water like a dog. They're not the elite troops. They are the weak troops. Because the point of the whole story is that it's not on your own strength, it's on God's strength. So Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap with the water with their tongues, as dog laps those who kneel to drink it. Anyway, the story goes on. And what they do at night to just conquer this group of 135,000 men with 300 men is they get these jars, okay? And they get these little torches. And it's interesting that this is a symbol. Does anybody know what this symbol is for? Ken Geed would know. He's not in here. Why would he know? He's a Gideon. The Gideons is the organization today that gives Bibles out to people all over the world. And this is the symbol because they trace who they are back to this story of Gideon. Okay, and this story is about a night attack here when he's victorious and about not being afraid. And the Gideon organization, I think, is like that. They're very bold in putting Bibles out in places where you wouldn't think you would find a Bible, and handing Bibles out in places that you wouldn't think about. In fact, Ken was telling me a while back that they were on William & Mary campus, and every year they would go there. They've told them they can't do it on campus anymore because the last time they did it on campus, they had these different stations where they just stand there and hand out little Bibles to people. And they put the boxes out at the different locations, and then they gather together as a group and pray, and then they go out and give the Bibles. Well, they put the boxes out, and they gather together in prayer, and there was a group of the Gideons that went to their spot, and the box was gone. Both boxes of Bibles were gone. And so they looked around and couldn't find it, and they seen some young person carrying one of their boxes. And so they ran, they followed him, and he took the box and he threw it in the trash can. And they went to him and they said, what did you do? He said, well, I don't know, I didn't do anything. They said, you just threw our box of Bibles in the trash can. He said, well, y'all don't need to be giving those out here. You know, it was not an environment that was encouraging that. But they weren't afraid. They got the Bibles out of the trash can and they kept giving them out. And now, even though they've told them they can't do it on campus anymore, they do it at the Wawa across the street and some of the other places across the street, and they still do it. You know, they do it, and they're not afraid to do it. And they take, they take their model, the original Gideon, who went up with 300 men against 135,000. So you might say, how did he do it? Well, let's look at it. Judges 7, verse 16. He divided 300 men into 3 companies. So 100 in each company. And he placed trumpets and empty jars, like clay jars and a trumpet, in the hands of all of them with torches inside of them. Okay, and he said, watch me, to all these guys. He said, follow my lead, and when I got to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. We're going to sneak up to the edge of the camp. And when I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, that's the signal from all around the camp to blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. It'll be in the middle of the night. And Gideon and the 100 men with him, because he split it in 3 groups of 100, reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. And so they did it when they had just changed watches in the middle of the night. So these guys were probably still half asleep. They had been asleep in their bunks, and now they had gotten up to do this watch. And so they just gotten on, on their watch. And they just changed the guard. And all of a sudden, they blew the trumpets, and they hear this cracking noise of the jars being cracked were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets, and they smashed the jars, okay? And so people who were on watch ran, okay? And they grasped the torches in their left hands, and they hold them in their right, blew the trumpets, they were to blow, and they shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. So with each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. And so what happened is these people in the front lines started running toward the rear of the camp. The people in the rear of the camp woke up middle of the night, thought that was Gideon that was attacking them, and so they attacked their own men. And so it was friendly fire between the Midians, and they basically killed each other and destroyed the army. And so there was just a little bit left, and they ran off. Why did that happen? Was it the strength of Gideon? Was it the strength of the 300? Nope. It was God. God gave them strength. He gave them the ability to be victorious, even though they were way outnumbered. And I'm sure Gideon was thankful. And I don't know what you're going through in your life. Maybe you're going through tough things. I mean, sometimes we all get weighed down by some of the problems going on. And problems happen everywhere. It happens in people's families. It happens in your finances. It happens in your struggles with health. It happens in your relationships with your parents or your children. And you think, man, what am I going to do to fix this? I cannot fix it. That's the first thing you need to realize. You cannot do it. But through Christ, all things are possible. And if you really get that today, if you really get that the strength you can have to live doesn't come from you, it comes from God. And just like God gave Gideon the strength to be victorious over this huge army, whatever your problems are, God can give you the strength to get through it. I don't know what the Midians are in your life. I don't know what about your worries are or what you're struggling with. Maybe it's with your relationship with your spouse. Maybe it's with something else that's going on with a child or a parent. Maybe it's some dreams that you had that didn't come true. But if you are not a small God person, if you are a big God person, you realize that God is in control. I don't understand it, but with his strength, I can get through all of this. Because just like that little girl was asked, how big are you? And she'd go, big. Somebody asks you, how big is God? Do you go like this? How big is God? God is big. God is powerful. God is all-knowing. God is all good. If we learn that together, if we remind each other, this is what I'm doing, just reminding you of a truth that you may have forgotten. Just like Gideon was able to overcome his fears and move forward in his life. And if you read the rest of the Gideon story, he became a very brave warrior indeed. Why? Because God gave him the strength to do it. God can give you the strength as well. It's the same God.